A little girl, just 6 years old, walks into a job interview in tears. What she says breaks the millionaire's heart and leaves the entire room in silence. Before we reveal how one woman's worst betrayal became the world's greatest lesson in forgiveness, drop a comment and tell us what part of the world you're watching from. The glass doors of Morrison Industries' 32nd floor swung open with a soft whoosh, revealing the pristine marble lobby where desperate souls came seeking employment. Jonathan Morrison, 28 years old with perfectly styled blonde hair and a navy suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, sat behind his mahogany desk reviewing resumes with the cold efficiency of a machine. His steel blue eyes scanned each application with calculated precision, dismissing candidates before they even spoke their first word. "Next," he called out, not bothering to look up from his leather-bound appointment book. The morning had been particularly brutal. 15 interviews, 15 rejections. His company needed reliable cleaning staff, not charity cases with sob stories. Time was money, and Jonathan Morrison had learned long ago that sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford in business. The sound of small footsteps echoed across the marble floor, so light they barely registered above the hum of the air conditioning. Jonathan's fingers drummed impatiently against his Mont Blanc pen as he waited for the candidate to reach his desk. When the footsteps stopped, he looked up expecting to see another middle-aged woman with calloused hands and tired eyes. Instead, he found himself staring at a tiny figure that barely reached the edge of his desk. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, stood before him with tears streaming down her dirt-smudged cheeks. Her long, tangled brown hair fell in messy waves around her shoulders, and her pink dress, once pretty but now wrinkled and stained, hung loosely on her small frame. In her tiny hands, she clutched a crumpled piece of paper that looked like it had been folded and unfolded 100 times. I came for the job," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the city traffic filtering through the floor-to-ceiling. Windows. Her lower lip trembled as she tried to stand straighter, attempting to appear professional despite being less than 4 feet tall. Jonathan's mouth fell open slightly, his pen freezing mid-drum against the desk. In all his years of conducting interviews, in all the business scenarios he'd imagined, nothing had prepared him for this moment. The absurdity of the situation hit him like a physical blow. A child, standing in his corporate office, asking for employment with the desperate earnestness of someone twice her age. "What are you doing here?" he managed to ask, his voice coming out harsher than intended. The question hung in the air between them like a challenge, and he watched as the little girl's tears began to fall faster, leaving clean tracks down her. Dirty cheeks dot the little girl's shoulders shook as she tried to compose herself, wiping her nose with the back of her small hand. She unfolded the crumpled paper with careful precision, smoothing it against the edge of Jonathan's desk as if it contained the most important information in the world. "My mama saw this in the newspaper," she said softly, her voice carrying a maturity that seemed impossible for someone so young. "It says you need people to clean. I can clean real good. I help Mama all the time." She looked up at him with enormous brown eyes that held a desperation Jonathan had never seen in a child before. Jonathan leaned back in his leather chair, trying to process what was happening. Behind the little girl, his secretary, Mrs. Patterson, appeared in the doorway with a look of complete bewilderment. She mouthed silently, "Should I call security?" But Jonathan held up a hand to stop her, something about the child's presence compelling him to listen. "Sweetheart," Jonathan said, softening his tone despite himself, "this isn't a place for children. Where's your mother? She should be here with you." He glanced toward the elevators, expecting to see a frantic parent rushing to collect their wayward child. The little girl's face crumpled at the mention of her mother, and fresh tears began to spill over. "That's why I'm here," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Mama won't wake up. I tried shaking her and calling her name, but she just lies there. I don't know what to do." She hiccuped through her tears, a sound echoing painfully. In the quiet office, Jonathan felt something cold settle in his stomach. The child's words carried an innocence that made them all the more terrifying. He'd heard enough from his staff about the rough neighborhoods where many of their cleaning crew lived, places where tragedy struck without warning and children were forced to grow up too fast. "What do you mean she won't wake up?" he asked gently, leaning forward in his chair. The business meeting he had scheduled in 10 minutes suddenly seemed completely unimportant compared to understanding what had brought this child to his office. The little girl shifted from foot to foot, clutching her piece of paper tighter. "Yesterday, she was really tired and kept coughing. Then this morning, I made her coffee like I always do, but when I brought it to her bed, she wouldn't drink it. I thought maybe if I got the job, I could buy medicine to make her better." Jonathan's throat tightened as he listened to the child's explanation. He'd built his empire by making quick, calculated decisions, but nothing in his business education had prepared him for this scenario. The little girl stood before him like a tiny warrior, fighting a battle no child should ever have to face alone. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice gentler than it had been all morning. He pushed aside the stack of resins, giving her his complete attention for the first time since she'd walked in. "Sophie," she replied, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her pink dress. "Sophie Chun, I'm 6 years old, and I know how to sweep and mop and fold laundry. Mama taught me everything." Her chin lifted with a pride that was heartbreaking in its innocence. Jonathan nodded slowly, trying to think of the right response. Every instinct told him to call social services immediately, but something about Sophie's determination gave him pause. She had come here seeking a solution, not a rescue, and that distinction seemed important somehow. "Sophie, how did you get here? Did you take the bus by yourself?" The concern in his voice was genuine now. The businessman facade completely dropped. The thought of this tiny girl navigating the city alone made his chest tight with worry. "I walked," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "It took a really long time, and my feet hurt, but I followed the address on the paper. A nice lady at the gas station told me which direction to go." She reached into her small pocket and pulled out a few crumpled dollar bills. "I saved my lunch money for 3 weeks to buy a newspaper so I could find a job." The revelation hit Jonathan like a physical blow. This child had planned her mission with the methodical determination of an adult, sacrificing her own needs to try to save her mother. He glanced at his Rolex. It was already 9:30 in the morning, which meant Sophie had likely been walking since dawn to reach his office building downtown. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway again, this time with a cup of hot chocolate and a concerned expression. She'd worked for Jonathan for 5 years and had never seen him spend this much time with any candidate, let alone a child who obviously couldn't work for them. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "your 10 o'clock appointment is here early. Should I ask them to wait?" Her eyes kept drifting to Sophie with a mixture of sympathy and confusion. Jonathan looked at Sophie, who was staring longingly at the hot chocolate, but making no move to ask for it. The polite desperation in her posture spoke volumes about her upbringing and her current situation. "Cancel my 10 o'clock, Jonathan said firmly, surprising both Mrs. Patterson and himself. Actually, cancel everything until noon. He'd never rearranged his schedule for anyone, but something about Sophie's situation demanded his immediate attention. Mrs. Patterson nodded and disappeared back toward the reception area, leaving Jonathan alone with the little girl. He watched as Sophie's eyes followed the cup of hot chocolate with obvious longing, but she remained perfectly still, clearly taught not to ask for things. "Would you like some hot chocolate, Sophie?" Jonathan asked, gesturing toward the cup Mrs. Patterson had left on a side table. "And maybe something to eat?" I think we have some cookies in the break room. Sophie's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. Yes, please, she whispered, then added quickly, but I can work for it. I don't take things for free. Mama says that's not right. Even in her desperate situation, she maintained a dignity that impressed Jonathan more than any resume ever. Had as Sophie carefully sipped the hot chocolate, warming her small hands around the ceramic mug, Jonathan studied her more closely. Despite the dirt and wrinkled clothes, there was something refined about her mannerisms, a careful politeness that spoke of good upbringing. Her mother had clearly tried to instill values in her daughter, even in what appeared to be desperate circumstances. Sophie, can you tell me your mother's name? Jonathan asked, pulling out his phone. I think we need to make sure she gets help right away. He was already mentally calculating which hospital was closest to the neighborhoods where his cleaning staff typically lived. The little girl set down her cup carefully and looked up. Him with those enormous brown eyes. Her name is Isabella Chun. She used to work at a big office building like this one, but she got sick and couldn't work anymore. That's why we don't have money for medicine or food sometimes. Jonathan's finger froze over his phone screen. Isabella Chun. The name hit him like a lightning bolt, sending his mind racing back 15 years to a different time, a different version of himself. His breath caught in his throat as memories he'd buried deep began to surface with painful clarity. Isabella Chun, he repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Does your mother have long black hair? About this tall? He held his hand up to indicate a height slightly shorter than his own 6-foot frame. Sophie nodded eagerly. Yes. Do you know my mama? She used to talk about working at a place with really nice people, but that was before I was born. She said they were like family to her. The corporate office seemed to spin around Jonathan as 15 years of carefully constructed walls came crashing down. Isabella Chun, the name he'd tried to forget, the woman who had haunted his dreams and shaped every relationship that came after. His hand trembled slightly as he set his phone down on the desk, the device suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. Sophie, he said carefully, his voice thick with emotion he was struggling to control. What happened to your father? The question came out before he could stop himself, driven by a desperate need to understand how Isabella's life had unfolded after she disappeared from his world. Sophie's face grew sad, and she looked down at her hands wrapped around the warm mug. Mama says I don't have a daddy. She says sometimes people love each other, but can't be together, and that's okay, because love doesn't always work the same way. Her words carried a rehearsed quality, as if Isabella had practiced this explanation many times. Jonathan's heart hammered against his ribs as pieces of a puzzle he'd never fully understood began clicking into place. The timeline fit perfectly. Sophie was 6 years old, which meant she would have been conceived right around the time Isabella had vanished from his life without explanation. The same time his father had been making business decisions that Jonathan was only now beginning to understand. Did your mama ever mention anyone named Jonathan? He asked, his voice barely steady. He knew he was crossing a line, but the need to know consumed him completely. Sophie's eyes brightened with recognition. Jonathan? Yes, she talks about Jonathan sometimes when she thinks I'm sleeping. She gets really sad and says his name like, it hurts her. Is that you? Are you the Jonathan who made my mama cry? Her innocent question cut through him like a blade, confirming his worst fears about what had happened all those years ago. Jonathan stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward as he moved to the window overlooking the city. His reflection in the glass showed a man grappling with a truth he wasn't prepared to face. Isabella had been pregnant with his child, and somehow he'd never known. Somehow his father's machinations had kept them apart during the most crucial time in both their lives. "Sophie," he said, turning back to face the little girl who might be his daughter, "we need to go see your mama right now. Can you show me where you live?" His voice was steady now, filled with a determination that had built his business empire, but had never been applied to something this personal. This important. Sophie nodded eagerly, sliding down from the adult-sized chair where she'd been perched. "Will you really help her? Will you make her better?" The hope in her voice was so pure, so complete, that Jonathan felt his chest constrict with the weight of responsibility. Jonathan's hands shook as he grabbed his car keys from the desk drawer, his mind racing with questions and possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider. In the span of 20 minutes, his entire world had shifted on its axis, and the little girl standing before him might hold the key to understanding why his life had felt incomplete for the past 6 years. "Mrs. Patterson," he called out as he guided Sophie toward the elevator, his hand gently resting on her small shoulder. "Clear my schedule for the rest of the day. Actually, clear it for the rest of the week. And call Dr. Martinez. Tell him I need him to make a house call immediately. It's an emergency." His secretary looked up from her computer with barely concealed shock. In 5 years of working for Jonathan Morrison, she'd never seen him act with such urgency about anything that wasn't directly related to corporate profits. The transformation was so complete, it was almost frightening. "Should I ask what this is regarding, Mr. Morrison?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her professional demeanor struggling to mask her curiosity about the sudden appearance of a child in their sterile corporate environment. "Family," Jonathan replied simply, the word carrying more weight than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. "This is about family." He pressed the elevator button with more force than necessary, his impatience to reach Isabella growing with each passing second. As they descended toward the parking garage, Sophie looked up at him with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Mr. Jonathan, are you really going to help my mama? She's been sad for such a long time, even before she got sick. Sometimes I hear her crying at night when she thinks I'm asleep." The elevator seemed to move impossibly slowly as Jonathan processed Sophie's words. The image of Isabella crying alone, struggling to raise their child without his knowledge or support, created a physical ache in his chest that no amount of business success could touch. "Yes, Sophie," he said firmly, crouching down to meet her at eye level. "I'm going to help your mama. I promise you that." As he spoke the words, he realized they represented the first genuine promise he'd made in years, not a business commitment or a strategic alliance, but a sacred vow to the child who had walked into his office and changed everything. The elevator doors opened to reveal Jonathan's pristine garage, where his collection of luxury vehicles waited in perfect rows. Sophie's eyes widened at the sight of so many expensive cars, her small hand instinctively reaching for his as they walked toward his silver Mercedes. "Are you very rich, Mr. Jonathan?" she asked with the blunt honesty that only children possessed. "Mama always says rich people don't care about people like us. But you seem nice." Jonathan's step faltered at Sophie's innocent observation, the truth of her mother's words cutting deeper than any business rival's insult ever could. He'd spent years building walls between himself and the world, using his wealth as both armor and weapon, never considering how that choice might be perceived by those who needed help most. "Sometimes money can make people forget what's really important," he admitted as he opened the passenger door for Sophie, adjusting the seat so she could see out the window safely. "But your mama taught you something very valuable, that how we treat others is more important than how much we have." Sophie climbed into the luxurious leather seat with careful reverence, her small hands running over the smooth surface, as if she were touching something magical. Mama says kindness doesn't cost anything, but it's worth more than all the money in the world. She always helps our neighbors, even when we don't have much food ourselves. As Jonathan started the engine, his mind filled with images of the Isabella he'd known 15 years ago. Brilliant, compassionate, always putting others before herself. It seemed that motherhood had only strengthened those qualities, even as circumstances had tested her in ways he could barely imagine. "Sophie, can you tell me about your mama's job before she got sick?" he asked as they pulled out of the garage. Into the bright morning sunlight. What kind of work did she do? He needed to understand how Isabella's life had unfolded, what circumstances had led to their current situation. "She worked at a big company like yours, but with computers," Sophie explained, her face lighting up with pride. "She was really smart and helped lots of people. But then she started getting tired all the time and had to go to doctors a lot. The company said they couldn't wait for her to get better, so they gave her job to someone else." Jonathan's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he recognized the familiar pattern of corporate callousness he'd witnessed countless times in his own business dealings. The irony wasn't lost on him that Isabella had likely faced the same kind of cold dismissal he'd been dishing out to job candidates just an hour earlier. "How long has your mama been sick?" he asked gently, taking the exit toward the older part of the city where many of his employees lived. The neighborhoods grew, progressively more warm as they drove, a stark contrast to the gleaming corporate towers they'd left behind. "About a year," Sophie replied, her voice growing quieter. "At first she just got tired easy, but then she started coughing all the time and couldn't eat much. She tries to hide it from me, but I know she hurts. Sometimes she can't get out of bed for whole days." The neighborhoods outside the Mercedes windows told a story of economic decline that Jonathan had been insulated from in his corporate tower. Broken streetlights stood like sentinels over cracked sidewalks, while corner stores advertised check-cashing services and lottery tickets behind bulletproof glass. This was a world away from his penthouse apartment and country club lifestyle. "Turn left here," Sophie instructed, pointing toward a narrow street lined with aging apartment buildings. "We live in the yellow one with the broken front steps. Mama always says to be careful going up them. Asterisk." Jonathan pulled up to a 3-story building that had clearly seen better decades. Paint peeled from its wooden siding like scales, and several windows were covered with cardboard instead of glass. The front steps Sophie had mentioned sagged dangerously to one side, held up by what appeared to be concrete blocks, and hoped not as they climbed the treacherous stairs. Sophie chattering nervously about which steps to avoid, Jonathan's chest tightened with each creak of the rotting wood. The hallway inside smelled of cooking oil and dampness, with thin carpeting that had been worn down to the backing in most places. "We're in 2B, Sophie said, producing a small key from her pocket with the pride of someone much older. "I always lock the door when I leave, because Mama says it's important to keep our things safe." She turned the key with both hands, the ancient mechanism protesting before finally giving way. The apartment that greeted them was a study in dignity despite poverty. Isabella had clearly done everything possible to make their small space feel like home. Colorful drawings covered the refrigerator, books were neatly arranged on makeshift shelves, and everything was spotlessly clean despite the building's overall condition. "Mama!" Sophie called out as she rushed toward the bedroom. "I brought help. The man from the job said he knows you." Jonathan followed slowly, his heart hammering as he prepared to see Isabella for the first time in 15 years. Nothing could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him in the small bedroom. A woman he'd once loved lying pale and still beneath a warm quilt, her breathing shallow and labored. Isabella Chun looked like a shadow of the vibrant woman he remembered. Her long black hair, once her crowning glory, lay limp against the pillow, and her face had the gaunt quality of someone fighting a battle she was slowly losing. Even unconscious, she radiated the same quiet strength that had first attracted him all those years ago. "Mama, wake up," Sophie whispered, climbing onto the bed and gently shaking Isabella's shoulder. "Mr. Jonathan is here to help you. He has a nice car and everything." Jonathan approached the bed slowly, his successful businessman's confidence completely abandoned in the face of this moment he'd never imagined possible. Isabella looked so fragile beneath the thin blanket, her breathing shallow and irregular in a way that immediately triggered every protective instinct he'd buried for years. "Isabella," he said softly, reaching out to touch her forehead. Her skin was burning with fever, and dark circles under her eyes spoke of pain that had been ignored for far too long. "What happened to you?" At the sound of his voice, Isabella's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, but gradually sharpening as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. When recognition finally dawned, her expression shifted through confusion, shock, and finally something that looked almost like relief. "Jonathan?" she whispered, her voice hoarse and barely audible. "Is this real, or am I dreaming again?" Her hand moved weakly toward him, then fell back to the bed as if the effort was too much. Sophie bounced on the edge of the bed with excitement. "Mama, he came to help us. I went to his office like you taught me about being brave, and he said he knows you from before." Her innocent joy at bringing together two people she cared about filled the small room with bittersweet energy. Isabella's eyes moved from Jonathan to Sophie, and understanding began to dawn in her fevered gaze. "Sophie, sweetheart, what did you do?" There was no anger in her voice, only a mother's concern mixed with exhaustion that went bone deep. "I got the job, Mama," Sophie announced proudly. "Well, maybe I got the job. Mr. Jonathan said he would help you first, and then we could talk about work. He has a really big office and everything." Jonathan felt his throat constrict as he watched the interplay between mother and daughter. Sophie's protective devotion to Isabella was clear in every gesture, every word. This tiny girl had somehow been carrying the weight of caring for her sick mother, and the responsibility should never have been hers to bear. "Isabella, we need to get you to a hospital immediately," Jonathan said, already reaching for his phone to call Dr. Martinez. "You're burning up with fever, and you need medical attention right now." Isabella shook her head weakly, trying to sit up. "No hospitals. Too expensive. Sophie needs what little money we have for food." Her words came in short bursts, each one clearly an effort. "Money isn't an issue," Jonathan said firmly, his business instincts finally finding something useful to focus on. "I'm taking care of everything. Sophie, can you pack a bag for your mama? Just important things she need." As Sophie rushed to gather items with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to be helpful beyond her years, Jonathan knelt beside Isabella's bed. 6 years of questions burned in his throat, but her current condition took priority over everything else. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly, his voice breaking slightly. "About Sophie." "About everything?" Isabella's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Jonathan, 15 years of separation and misunderstanding visible in her gaze. "Your father," she whispered, each word clearly an effort. "He said you never wanted to see me again. That the pregnancy would ruin your future. He gave me money to disappear." The words hit Jonathan like physical blows, each revelation reshaping his understanding of the past 6 years. His father, Richard Morrison, had built the family empire on calculated moves and strategic eliminations of anything he deemed problematic. Jonathan had always known his father was ruthless in business, but he'd never imagined that ruthlessness extending to his personal life. "He told me you'd left for another job opportunity," Jonathan said, his voice thick with rage and regret. "Said you didn't want to be contacted. I tried to find you for months, but every lead went nowhere." He ran his hands through his hair, the perfectly styled image he maintained crumbling completely. Sophie appeared in the doorway with a small duffel bag, her face serious with the responsibility of caring for her mother. "I packed Mama's medicine and her favorite sweater," she announced. "And Mr. Bunny for me, in case I have to stay at the hospital too." The sight of this 6-year-old girl planning for the possibility of sleeping in a hospital waiting room crystallized everything for Jonathan. Whatever complicated history existed between him and Isabella, whatever pain and misunderstanding had kept them apart, none of it mattered as much as the immediate needs of this family. His family. "Nobody's sleeping in any waiting rooms," Jonathan said firmly, scooping Isabella into his arms with surprising gentleness. She weighed far less than she should have, her body trembling with fever and exhaustion. "Sophie, you're coming with us, and we're going to make sure your mama gets the best care possible." As they made their way back down the broken stairs, Sophie holding carefully to Jonathan's jacket, Isabella stirred in his arms. "Jonathan," she murmured against his shoulder, "I'm sorry for everything. I should have tried harder to reach you." "Save your strength," he replied, but his voice was gentle now, filled with a tenderness that had been absent from his life for years. "We have a lot to talk about, but first we're going to get you well. Sophie needs her mama healthy, and He paused, the words catching in his throat. "I need both of you in my life." The Mercedes had never carried more precious cargo as they raced toward the hospital. Sirens from the ambulance Jonathan had called echoing behind them. In the rearview mirror, he could see Sophie holding Isabella's hand, whispering reassurances with a maturity that broke his heart and filled him with pride in equal measure. The emergency room at the St. Mary's Hospital had never seen a patient arrive with such an entourage. Dr. Martinez, Jonathan's personal physician, was already waiting with a team of specialists when they rushed through the automatic doors. Isabella was immediately whisked away on a gurney while Sophie clung to Jonathan's hand, her eyes wide with fear as her mother disappeared behind curtains and medical equipment. "Is Mama going to be okay?" Sophie asked, her small voice nearly lost in the chaos of the emergency room. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency around them, but Jonathan could see the overwhelming nature of the medical environment through a 6-year-old's eyes. "The doctors here are the best in the city," Jonathan assured her, though his own heart was racing with worry. "They're going to take very good care of your mama." He guided Sophie to a quiet corner of the waiting area, away from the more dramatic cases that filled the emergency room. Dr. Martinez appeared after what felt like hours, but had only been 30 minutes. His expression was serious, but not hopeless, which Jonathan took as a positive sign. "She's severely dehydrated and has pneumonia," he explained quietly. "It's progressed further than it should have because she waited too long to seek treatment. We're starting her on 4 antibiotics immediately." Jonathan felt something cold settle in his stomach. How long has she been this sick? He thought about Sophie's casual mention of her mother being tired for a year, the child's matter-of-fact acceptance of a situation that should have been treated months ago. "Based on her symptoms and Sophie's description, I'd say she's been fighting this for weeks, maybe longer," Dr. Martinez replied. "She's malnourished as well, which has compromised her immune system. This is what happens when people can't afford proper medical care." His words carried a weight of judgment that made Jonathan uncomfortable with his own privileged position. Sophie tugged on Jonathan's jacket sleeve. "Can I see her now? I promise I'll be really quiet and good." Her earnest request reminded him that this child had been her mother's primary caregiver, a responsibility no 6-year-old should ever have to bear. "Soon, sweetheart," Jonathan said, crouching down to her level. "The doctors need to help your mama first, but then we'll go see her together." He was making promises he wasn't sure he could keep, but the trust in Sophie's eyes demanded nothing less than his complete commitment. The waiting room had become their temporary home, and Jonathan found himself seeing the world through Sophie's perspective. She colored quietly in a coloring book a nurse had provided, occasionally looking up to ask innocent questions about the medical equipment or other patients. Her resilience amazed him. This tiny girl had faced more hardship in 6 years than many adults experienced in a lifetime. "Mr. Jonathan," Sophie said suddenly, looking up from her drawing of what appeared to be a family of 3 standing in front of a house. "When Mama gets better, will you still want to know us? Mama says sometimes people help because they feel sorry for you, but then they go away when they don't feel sorry anymore." Jonathan's breath caught at Sophie's question, the child's wisdom cutting straight to the heart of his deepest fears. How could he explain to a 6-year-old that he'd been searching for them without knowing it, that every relationship in his life had felt incomplete because of their absence? "Sophie, look at me," he said gently, taking her small hands in his. "Larger ones. I'm not going anywhere. Not ever. Your mama and I knew each other a long time ago, and I've been hoping to find you both for years. I just didn't know you existed until today." Sophie's eyes widened with curiosity. "Were you and Mama boyfriend and girlfriend? Like in the movies?" Her innocent question carried the weight of years of wondering about her father, and Jonathan felt the responsibility of answering honestly while remaining age-appropriate. "Yes, we were," Jonathan admitted, his voice soft with memory. "We cared about each other very much, but sometimes grown-ups have misunderstandings that keep them apart. That's what happened to us, but it wasn't because we didn't love each other." "Do you think?" Sophie began hesitantly, then stopped as if afraid to voice her deepest hope. "Do you think maybe you could be my daddy? I know I'm supposed to already have one, but Mama says sometimes families are made in different ways." The simple question shattered every defense Jonathan had built around his heart. This brave little girl, who had walked across the city to find work, who had cared for her sick mother with the devotion of someone twice her age, was asking if he wanted to be her father. The answer had been growing in his chest since the moment she'd said Isabella's name. "I would be honored to be your daddy, Sophie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If that's what you want, and if your mama says it's okay, then yes. I want to be part of your family more than anything in the world." Sophie's face lit up with pure joy, and she threw her small arms around Jonathan's neck with such force that he nearly fell backward in his chair. "I knew it," she whispered against his shoulder. "I knew you were special when you gave me hot chocolate without me having to ask for it." Dr. Martinez reappeared in the waiting area, his expression noticeably brighter than it had been earlier. "Good news," he announced. "Isabella is responding well to the antibiotics. Her fever is breaking, and she's asking for both of you. We've moved her to a private room on the 3rd floor." The elevator ride to Isabella's room felt both eternal and instantaneous. Jonathan's mind raced with questions about their future, about legal paternity tests, about how to rebuild a relationship that had been shattered by deception and misunderstanding. But Sophie's small hand in his grounded him in the present moment. Isabella's room was filled with afternoon sunlight streaming through large windows that overlooked the city. She looked infinitely better than she had that morning. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her breathing was steady and deep. When she saw them enter, tears spilled down her face. My brave girl, Isabella whispered as Sophie climbed carefully onto the hospital bed. You did such a good job taking care of Mama. I'm so proud of you. Jonathan stood awkwardly by the door, unsure of his place in this reunion. 15 years of separation had created a chasm he wasn't sure how to bridge. Despite the connection he felt with Sophie, Isabella's eyes met Jonathan's across the hospital room, and in that gaze he saw forgiveness, gratitude, and something that looked like the love they'd once shared. The beeping of medical equipment provided a gentle soundtrack to their reunion, while Sophie chattered excitedly about their day together. Sophie told me you two had quite an adventure, Isabella said softly, her voice still weak, but infinitely stronger than it had been that morning. She said you promised to be her daddy. The statement hung in the air between them, heavy with implications and possibilities. Jonathan moved closer to the bed, his businessman's confidence replaced by the uncertainty of a man navigating uncharted emotional territory. We have a lot to talk about, he said carefully. About the past, about your father's interference, about Sophie's future. But right now, all that matters is that you're going to be okay. Your father, Isabella repeated, understanding crossing her features. He told me you knew about the pregnancy and wanted nothing to do with either of us. He said you'd paid him to make me disappear. Her words carried no accusation, only the weary resignation of someone who'd accepted a painful truth. He lied to both of us, Jonathan said, his anger at his deceased father's manipulation burning fresh despite the years that had passed. I spent months looking for you. I hired private investigators. I called every mutual friend we had. When I couldn't find you, I assumed you'd chosen to leave. Sophie looked back and forth between the adults, clearly sensing the emotional undercurrents she couldn't fully understand. Are you sad about Grandpa being mean? She asked Jonathan with characteristic directness. Mama says sometimes people do bad things because they're scared, but that doesn't make it okay. The wisdom in Sophie's simple observation struck both adults speechless. This child, who had grown up without a father because of one man's selfish machinations, was offering comfort and understanding that many adults couldn't manage. Your grandpa made some very bad choices, Jonathan told Sophie honestly. But those choices brought me to you today, so maybe something good can come from something bad. He reached out tentatively and touched Sophie's hand, still amazed by the reality of her existence. Isabella watched the interaction between Jonathan and Sophie with tears in her eyes. She's always been wise beyond her years, she said quietly. Having to grow up fast made her that way. I tried to give her as normal a childhood as possible, but when you're poor and sick, she trailed off, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. That's all going to change now, Jonathan said firmly. Both of you are going to have everything you need. The best medical care, a safe place to live, educational opportunities for Sophie. I have 6 years to make up for, and I intend to start immediately. Dr. Martinez knocked on the doorframe before entering with a chart in his hands. I have Isabella's treatment plan, he announced. She'll need to stay here for another 3 days while we monitor her recovery, but the prognosis is excellent. With proper rest and nutrition, she should make a complete recovery. Sophie clapped her hands together with delight. Did you hear that, Mama? You're going to be all better. Her joy was infectious, filling the hospital room with hope and possibility. What? About after she's discharged? Jonathan asked Dr. Martinez. What kind of ongoing care will she need? He was already mentally calculating the costs and logistics of providing Isabella with the best possible medical support. Dr. Martinez reviewed Isabella's chart with the thoroughness that Jonathan's money could buy. She needs several weeks of rest and proper nutrition to fully recover her strength. The pneumonia has been hard on her system, and the malnutrition will take time to reverse. But with the right care, She should be back to full health within a month or two. Jonathan nodded, already forming plans for Isabella's recovery. His penthouse apartment had a guest wing that would be perfect for them, with plenty of space for Sophie to play and explore safely. But as he began to voice these thoughts, Isabella held up a weak hand to stop him. "Jonathan, we need to talk about this carefully," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I appreciate everything you've done today. You probably saved my life. But we can't just jump into playing house because Sophie wants a father, and you feel guilty about the past." Her words stung because they contained enough truth to be uncomfortable. Jonathan had been operating on emotion and instinct since Sophie had walked into his office. But Isabella was right to demand a more thoughtful approach to their situation. "You're right," he admitted, sinking into the visitor's chair beside her. "Bed, this is all happening very fast. But Isabella, I need you to know that my feelings aren't just guilt or obligation. Seeing Sophie today, learning she's my daughter, it's like finding a piece of myself I didn't know was missing." Sophie looked between the adults with growing concern. "Are you going to fight about me?" she asked quietly. "Because I don't want anyone to be sad anymore. We were all sad before, but today we were happy." Isabella reached out and stroked Sophie's hair with infinite tenderness. "Nobody's fighting, sweetheart. We're just talking about how to make sure everyone stays happy and safe. That's what grown-ups do when they care about each other. While you're recovering," Jonathan said carefully, "I'd like you both to stay at my apartment. Sophie can have her own room, and you'll have round-the-clock nursing care if needed. It would give us time to figure out the long-term arrangements without any pressure." Isabella considered his offer, clearly weighing the benefits against the potential complications. "What about work? I can't live off your charity indefinitely. Jonathan, I need to be able to support Sophie myself." "Your job right now is getting healthy," Jonathan said firmly. "When you're ready to work again, if you want to work again, we'll figure out something that makes sense for all of us. But Sophie's mother being financially stressed and medically neglected is never happening again." The conviction in his voice seemed to reassure Isabella, and she nodded slowly. "Okay, we'll try it. But I want to establish some ground rules about Sophie. She's been through enough instability. Any decisions about her future need to be made together, and her well-being comes first." "Agreed," Jonathan said immediately. "I want to be her father, but I understand I have to earn that role. I've missed 6 years of her life, and I can't just step in and expect her to accept me automatically." Sophie giggled from her position, curled against Isabella's side. "I already accept you, Mr. Jonathan. You're nice, and you smell good, and you have a really fancy car. Plus, you made Mama smile for the first time in forever." 3 days later, Jonathan stood in his penthouse apartment, watching Sophie explore her new bedroom with the wonder of a child discovering a magical kingdom. The room had been hastily but thoughtfully prepared: soft pink walls, a canopy bed, fit for a princess, and enough toys and books to stock a small store. Her squeals of delight echoed through the apartment as she discovered each new treasure. Isabella sat in the living room, still weak but infinitely better than she'd been when Sophie had first brought Jonathan to their apartment. The contrast between their old living situation and Jonathan's luxury penthouse was stark, but Isabella was handling the transition with the grace that had first attracted him to her years ago. "She's never had her own room before," Isabella said, softly, watching through the doorway as Sophie arranged her few possessions among the abundance of new things. "We've been sharing a bed since she was born. I was worried she'd be scared sleeping alone. We can move a bed into your room if she needs it," Jonathan offered, sitting on the sofa beside Isabella, but maintaining a respectful distance. They were still navigating the boundaries of their renewed relationship, both aware of how much had changed since they'd known each other before. "Look what I found." Sophie burst into the living room carrying a large book about horses. "Can we read this together? All three of us?" Her request for inclusion warmed Jonathan's heart in ways he hadn't expected. As they settled together on the sofa with Sophie between them, Jonathan caught Isabella's eye over their daughter's head. The word daughter still felt miraculous in his mind. This incredible little person was half his, carried within her his genetic legacy and Isabella's nurturing love. "Mama, are we going to live here forever?" Sophie asked as she turned the pages of her book. "Because I really like it. But I miss Mrs. Rodriguez from downstairs. She used to give me cookies when you were too sick to make dinner." Isabella's face flushed with embarrassment at this casual revelation of their previous hardships. But Jonathan felt only admiration for the neighbors who had helped care for his daughter when he hadn't even known she existed. "We'll visit Mrs. Rodriguez soon," Jonathan promised. "And if you want to invite her here for dinner, we can do that too. Just because we live somewhere new doesn't mean we forget the people who were kind to us." The doorbell chimed, and Jonathan excused himself to answer it. Dr. Martinez stood in the hallway with a manila envelope in his hands, his expression serious but not alarming. "I have the results you requested," Dr. Martinez said quietly, handing over the envelope. Inside were the paternity test results that Jonathan had insisted on having done, not because he doubted Sophie's parentage, but because he wanted everything to be legally clear for her future protection. Jonathan's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope, though he already knew what the results would confirm. The scientific certainty of his fatherhood was spelled out in percentages and genetic markers, but the emotional certainty had been established the moment Sophie had asked if he wanted to be her daddy. 99.9% probability of paternity, he read. Aloud, though the number seemed inadequate to describe the profound connection he felt to the little girl reading about horses in his living room. When he returned to the sofa, Isabella looked at him questioningly. He showed her the results silently, watching as relief and something that might have been happiness crossed her features. "So it's official," she said quietly. "Sophie has a father." "She's always had a father," Jonathan corrected gently. "I just didn't know I was him." 2 weeks into their new living arrangement, Jonathan found himself falling into a routine he'd never imagined possible. Morning cartoons replaced financial news. Bedtime stories took precedence over late-night conference calls, and his refrigerator was stocked with juice boxes and string cheese instead of champagne and imported delicacies. "Daddy, can you help me with my shoelaces?" Sophie called from her bedroom, the word "Daddy" still sending a thrill through Jonathan's chest every time she used it. She'd started calling him that naturally after the first week, as if the title had always belonged to him. Isabella had been watching these interactions with a mixture of joy and apprehension. Her health was steadily improving, and with it came the energy to worry about the long-term implications of their situation. Jonathan was wonderful with Sophie, patient and loving, in ways she hadn't dared to hope for, but she couldn't shake the fear that this domestic bliss was temporary. "We need to talk about the future," Isabella said one evening after Sophie had gone to bed. They were sitting on his terrace overlooking the city, the lights below creating a romantic backdrop that felt both appropriate and dangerous. "What specifically?" "About the future?" Jonathan asked, though he could see the concern in her eyes. They'd been dancing around several important conversations since moving in together, both afraid to disturb the fragile peace they'd established. "Sophie starts school in the fall," Isabella began. She's been accepted to the public school near our old apartment, but now, she gestured around at the luxury that surrounded them. I don't know what's best for her anymore. Jonathan had been thinking about Sophie's education constantly since learning about her existence. His connections could get her into the most exclusive private schools in the city, institutions that would prepare her for an elite university education and open doors he'd never had access to despite his wealth. There's a wonderful private school about 10 minutes from here, he said carefully. Small classes, excellent teachers, programs for gifted children. I could have her enrolled by next week. Isabella was quiet for a moment, staring out at the city lights. She's never been around wealthy children before. What if she doesn't fit in? What if they make her feel different or less than? The concern in Isabella's voice revealed deeper fears about their situation. She was worried about more than just Sophie's education. She was worried about losing her daughter to a world she couldn't navigate herself. Isabella, look at me, Jonathan said gently. Sophie is remarkable because of how you raised her. Her kindness, her resilience, her wisdom, those things came from you. No school is going to change who she is at her core. But money changes everything, Isabella replied. You've seen how she looks at this apartment, at your cars, at the toys you buy her. She's starting to think this is normal. And what happens? When she realizes most people don't live like this? Jonathan understood Isabella's concerns because he'd been grappling with similar questions himself. How do you give a child advantages without spoiling them? How do you provide security without creating entitlement? Then we teach her, he said finally. We make sure she understands how fortunate she is, and we raise her to use that fortune responsibly. We involve her in charity work. We maintain relationships with people from all walks of life, and we never let her forget where she came from. Isabella nodded slowly, but Jonathan could see she wasn't entirely convinced. A gap between there. Backgrounds felt vast in moments like this. Despite the love they both felt for Sophie Dot, the conversation about Sophie's future opened floodgates of other discussions they'd been avoiding. Over the next few days, as Isabella's strength continued to return, they tackled topics ranging from legal custody arrangements to their own relationship status with the careful navigation of two people afraid to break something precious. I want to adopt Sophie officially, Jonathan said one morning as they watched her play in the apartment's private garden area. I know I'm already her biological father, but I want the legal recognition too. I want her to have my name if she wants it, and I want to make sure she's protected if anything happens to either of us. Isabella had been expecting this conversation, but hearing the words still made her emotional. She'd like that, she said, quietly. She's been drawing pictures of herself with your last name. Morrison is easier to spell than Chun anyway. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Sophie chase butterflies among the carefully maintained flower beds. The sight of her laughing and playing with the carefree abandon of a truly happy child was something Isabella had despaired of ever seeing again. Jonathan, Isabella began hesitantly, what happens between us? I mean, we're living together, raising a child together, but we haven't really talked about what this means for our relationship. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and fear in equal measure. Jonathan had been wondering the same thing, feeling the old attraction to Isabella, complicated by their shared responsibility for Sophie and the years of separation that lay between them. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "I know I love Sophie, and I know I care deeply about you. But I also know we're not the same people we were 15 years ago. We both have scars from what happened, and I don't want to assume anything." Isabella appreciated his honesty, even as part of her hoped he would declare undying love and sweep her off her feet like something out of the romance novels she secretly read. "I've been alone for 6 years," she said quietly. "I haven't dated anyone seriously because no one could understand that Sophie came first, always. But you, I understand because she comes first for me too now," Jonathan finished. "She's the most important person in both our lives, which gives us something solid to build on, even if we're not sure what we're building." Sophie's laughter drew their attention back to the garden, where she was now trying to teach a butterfly to sit on her finger. Her patience and gentleness with the tiny creature exemplified everything wonderful about her character. "She deserves to see what a healthy relationship looks like," Isabella said thoughtfully. "I never want her to settle for less than she deserves, because she didn't have good examples growing up." "Then we figure it out," Jonathan said, reaching over to take Isabella's hand. "We take it slow, we communicate honestly, and we make sure Sophie always feels secure regardless of what happens between us romantically." The touch of his hand sent familiar electricity through Isabella's system, reminding her of why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. But she was older now, wiser, and she knew that love alone wasn't enough to build a lasting relationship. "I'd like that," she said simply, squeezing his hand before letting go. "But I have conditions." Jonathan smiled at her businesslike tone. "Name them." "I want to go back to work when I'm fully recovered. I need to contribute financially and professionally, not just be supported by you. And I want us to have our own space eventually, maybe a house where Sophie can have a yard, but we each have our own rooms until we figure out if this is going to work long term." Jonathan's response to Isabella's conditions revealed the depth of change that had occurred in him since Sophie had walked into his office. The man who had once needed to control every aspect of his environment found himself genuinely excited by Isabella's desire for independence and partnership rather than dependence. "I've actually been thinking about getting out of the corporate world entirely," he admitted, surprising himself with the words. "These past few weeks with Sophie have shown me what I've been missing. I want to be present for her childhood, not just financially supportive from a distance." Isabella looked at him with surprise. The Jonathan she'd known 15 years ago had been driven by ambition and the need to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. This version seemed to have found peace with different priorities. "What would you do instead?" she asked, genuinely curious about this new direction his thoughts were taking. "I've been thinking about starting a foundation," Jonathan said, his voice gaining enthusiasm as he spoke. "Something focused on helping single parents in situations like yours was. Providing medical care, child care, job training, all the support systems that could have prevented you and Sophie from going through what you did." The idea was clearly something he'd been developing in his mind for several days, and Isabella could see the appeal it held for him. It would allow him to use his business skills and financial resources for something meaningful, while giving him the flexibility to be present for Sophie's daily life. "Sophie would be proud of that," Isabella said softly. "She's always been sensitive to other people's struggles. Having a father who helps families like ours used to be would mean everything to her." Their conversation was interrupted by Sophie herself, who came running in from the garden with dirt on her dress and joy radiating from every pore. "Daddy! Mama! The butterfly, let me pet it. Look." She held out her finger, which still had traces of the delicate creature's wing dust. "That's amazing, sweetheart," Jonathan said, crouching down to examine her finger with appropriate reverence. You must have been very gentle and patient for the butterfly to trust you like that. Mrs. Rodriguez taught me about being gentle with small things, Sophie said proudly. She said even the tiniest creatures have important jobs to do in the world, so we should always be respectful. Isabella exchanged a meaningful look with Jonathan over Sophie's head. The wisdom their neighbor had shared with Sophie was exactly the kind of value system they wanted to preserve and nurture, regardless of their changed circumstances. Speaking of Mrs. Rodriguez, Jonathan said, I was thinking we could invite her and some of your other friends from the old neighborhood over for dinner this weekend. Would you like that? Sophie's face lit up with pure delight. Really? Can we make her favorite cookies? And can I show her my new room? Her excitement at the prospect of sharing her good fortune with someone who had been kind to her spoke volumes about her character. Of course, Isabella said, touched by Jonathan's thoughtfulness in maintaining Sophie's connection to their past. Maybe we could even ask her to teach us some of her recipes. As Sophie danced around the room with happiness, Jonathan caught Isabella, watching him with something that looked like the beginning of love rekindled. The realization filled him with hope and terror in equal measure. He had everything to gain and everything to lose. Thank you, Isabella said quietly when Sophie had skipped off to plan the dinner party. For understanding that our past matters, that the people who helped us matter. You could have swept us away from all of that. Sophie is who she is because of where she came from, Jonathan replied. I'd never want to erase that. Besides, I'm curious about these neighbors who took care of my daughter when I couldn't. The dinner party that weekend became a bridge between two worlds that had seemed impossible to connect. Mrs. Rodriguez, a tiny elderly woman with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, arrived at Jonathan's penthouse with a covered dish and a kind of maternal authority that transcended economic boundaries. So you're the famous Jonathan, she said, looking him up and down with frank assessment. Sophie talks about you constantly. My daddy this, my daddy that. I was beginning to think you were imaginary. Jonathan found himself nervous under her scrutiny in a way he'd never been in any boardroom. This woman's approval mattered because she'd been there when he hadn't, caring for his daughter with the love he should have been providing. I'm sorry I wasn't there before, he said simply. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Mrs. Rodriguez studied him for another long moment and nodded with satisfaction. Good. That little girl has been taking care of everyone else her whole life. It's time someone took care of her properly. Sophie gave Mrs. Rodriguez the grand tour of the apartment with pride and excitement, showing off every detail while carefully explaining how she was learning to appreciate nice things, without forgetting to be grateful. Her mature perspective on her changed circumstances impressed everyone present. She's grown up so much in just these few weeks, Mrs. Rodriguez observed to Isabella as they watched Sophie demonstrate her new art supplies. But she's still the same sweet girl who used to knock on my door, watching the man she'd once loved completely absorbed in making their daughter happy. I don't know, she admitted. It's complicated. Love always is, Mrs. Rodriguez said pragmatically. But some complications are worth working through, especially when there's a little girl who deserves to see her parents happy together. The evening ended with promises to maintain regular contact and plans for Mrs. Rodriguez to teach Sophie how to make her famous empanadas. As Jonathan helped her to the taxi he'd arranged, the elderly woman gripped his arm with surprising strength. Don't you dare hurt them again, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd witnessed too much heartbreak. That little girl has already been through enough disappointment for 10 lifetimes. I won't, Jonathan promised, meaning it with every fiber of his being. They're the most important things in my world now. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded with satisfaction and patted his cheek gently. Good boy. Isabella chose well, even if it took 15 years to work out. 6 months later, Jonathan stood in the backyard of their new house, watching Sophie push Isabella on the swing set he'd installed the week before. The house was perfect, large enough for everyone to have their own space, but warm and welcoming in a way his sterile peghouse had never been. Most importantly, it felt like home in a way nowhere else ever had. The foundation was officially launching next month, with Isabella as the program director and Jonathan as the financial backer. They'd spent weeks interviewing families and situations similar to what Isabella and Sophie had faced, and the stories had only strengthened their resolve to make a real difference in people's lives. "Higher, Mama," Sophie called out, her laughter carrying across the yard. At 7 years old now, she'd grown more confident and outgoing while maintaining the essential kindness that defined her character. Her new school had been a perfect fit, challenging enough to engage her bright mind while nurturing her natural empathy. Isabella caught Jonathan's eye as she pumped her legs to go higher on the swing, her face radiant with happiness and health. The gaunt, desperate woman he'd found in that tiny apartment had been replaced by someone vibrant and strong, though she carried the wisdom of her struggles with grace. "Daddy, come push me next," Sophie called, and Jonathan felt the familiar thrill of being claimed so completely by this remarkable little girl. The adoption had been finalized 3 months ago, making their family legally official, but the emotional bonds had been forged from that first day in his office dot as he jogged toward the swing set. Jonathan's phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer. The final papers for his father's estate had been processed, and the money that had once been used to separate him from Isabella was now funding their foundation's first major initiative, a comprehensive family support center in the neighborhood, where they'd found Sophie and Isabella. "What's making you smile like that?" Isabella asked as she slowed her swing to a stop. Over the past months, they'd been slowly rebuilding their romantic relationship alongside their partnership as parents. The foundation work had shown them how well they collaborated, while living together had revealed how much they'd both changed and grown. "Just thinking about how different things are from a year ago," Jonathan replied, catching Sophie as she jumped from her swing with characteristic fearlessness. "If someone had told me then that a 6-year-old girl would walk into my office,